Hey everyone, Alec from Shape Gaming here. The Season 3 dungeon pool has been released, and I have to say that I'm pretty excited for most of the dungeons they've selected for us in patch 10.2. I want to spend this video taking a look at categorizing these dungeons for their potential difficulty as Mythic Plus dungeons for healers. If you find the content helpful or interesting, I'd appreciate you hitting that like and subscribe button. Alright, before we take a look at the dungeons, let's take a second to provide some guiding principles for our tier list. Remember, we're taking a look at these dungeons from a healer's perspective to better understand how difficult they might be at launch for us. However, this discussion will more than likely be applicable for other classes as well. All of these dungeons have to undergo tuning. Some will potentially require less because we've seen them in Mythic Plus iterations in the past expansions, while others are brand new and will likely require more tuning and potential hotfixes when they go live. We're also going to try to rank these dungeons based on their potential difficulty without any consideration for affixes, because adding affixes makes each dungeon a little easier, a little harder, and will make this video 2 to 3 hours long. So let's start off by taking a look at the dungeon pool that we've been given for Season 3. Our list has the Mega Dungeons split into 2 different tiers like we've seen in past expansions. For Legion, we have Darkheart Thicket and Blackheart Cold. For Battle for Azeroth expansion, we have Waycrest Manor and Athal Dazar. For Warlords of Draenor, we have Everbloom. And for Cataclysm, we have Throne of Tides. As I mentioned before, I'm actually pretty excited about this Season 3 pool, except for Throne of Tides. If Blizzard never showed me this dungeon again and just deleted it, I probably would never care. Alright, so let's dig into this tier list. Let's start by taking a look at Athal Dazar. I've always enjoyed doing this dungeon in BFA back when it was a Mythic Plus. You had a little pathing variability, which is always nice. However, I'm guessing Blizzard will fix the snapping that groups used to do, which will force teams to rethink strategy for this dungeon. If we look at ads, I recall the reanimated horror guards hitting hard with their nasty AoE attack once you've destroyed those totems that keep them alive. The other pack that I often ran into issues with were the Feasting Sky Screamers, but if your group remembers to kick their fear, you shouldn't have many issues. If we look at bosses, the only challenging ones are Volkal and Yasma. Volkal requires a little more coordination and can be a pug killer if your group doesn't understand the mechanic. For this boss, you have 2 priorities, kicking the AoE poison and killing the 3 totems within the same few seconds of each other. If you don't do one of these 2 things as you move into higher keys, you will easily run out of mana and die. It also doesn't help that the platform where you fight him is pretty large, so it's easy for your team to outrange your heals. Moving on to the other boss, Yasma, she has the creepy spiders that get large and chase you at regular intervals. If one of these hits you on a high tyrannical week, you can almost guarantee you're dying. The other important thing is to keep the spirits that she summons from your body away from her, as these have to be slowed and killed before reaching her. The only other challenge with this one is eventually you lose real estate to move around because the shadow puddles on the ground. Overall, the dungeon isn't too particularly difficult, as long as you have a couple kicks and a couple slows. I think, for me, this dungeon easily fits into the best dungeon to heal, and one that I'll always be happy to heal. Moving on to our other dungeon from BFA's Waycrest Manor. This is another dungeon that I enjoyed due to the overall theme and some pathing variation, although forced a little bit by Blizzard. Overall, from an ad perspective, the ones to always look out for are any of the Coven and the Thornguard ads. Most of the other mobs in this dungeon do a lot of damage, but really just require dodging mechanics and straight healing. On the other hand, there are some bosses in this dungeon that are healing intensive. The Soulbound Goliath does a hard-hitting tank damage as he continues to gain stacks, and he will also cast a Thorin spell on a person that requires healing as your team breaks them out of it with damage. At some point in the encounter, the tank will have to run the boss through a patch of fire to cleanse his stacking damage buff. This does a moderate amount of AoE fire damage that you'll also have to prepare a cooldown for. The Heartsbane Triad can be a particularly painful boss to heal as you have to target each sister as she holds Iris and rotate your group's kicks. In particular, Sister Briar has a Jagged Nettles attack that continues to deal damage until you heal a party member above 90%. This has to be healed immediately or you will fall behind and the player will die. Sister Melody has an aura that forces you to move in order to remove it or take stacking damage. She also puts a mark on a player that requires you to spread so you don't take too much AoE damage. Finally, Sister Selena has an aura that reduces healing by 50%, and she will also take control of random allies and force you to DPS the ally down in order to break it. Both Lord and Lady Waycrest and Gorak Toll have decent AoE damage, but nothing too crazy. When we look at ranking, this is another dungeon that I enjoy healing. I feel that this one will fall into the not too bad category, as I think it's definitely more challenging than Athal Dazar, but overall, a pretty fun dungeon to heal. Alright, moving on to Blackheart Cold. Starting off, this dungeon is much more linear in pathing choices that you're offered. I also remember this Legion dungeon actually having more difficult mobs and bosses. In this dungeon, many of the mobs need to be CC'd or your group needs to rotate kicks because the mobs hit pretty hard. The Protectors cast a spell that reduces damage done to other mobs that you group up. The Counselors have Dark Mending spell that heals all other mobs by 15% every 5 seconds if not kicked. The Retainers cast a random Soul Blade attack that puts a nasty debuff on players that should be dispelled. As you move up the stairs, there are spiders that could potentially deal a good amount of damage through a stacking debuff, and that has to be dispelled as well. When you get all the way up the stairs, you're met with more mobs that need to be controlled. The Risen Scouts do a channeled knife dance that does a lot of AoE damage that can only be stunned. The Risen Archers have no aggro table and will randomly attack team members similar to the Pelters that we see in Neltharion's Lair. And the Risen Companion will randomly leap doing AoE damage and leaving a stacking dot on any players that are in range. Following the second boss, you have an Indiana Jones-like gauntlet where boulders roll down the stairs and try to stun you. Following that gauntlet, you then have another gauntlet that you have to run through. In these areas, you'll encounter Wrathguard Blade Lords and Fellhounds that will enrage at 25% HP remaining. Wormtongue adds that can do a lot of damage if not managed quickly, and then Dominators and Bats. The Bats have to be AoE down as they continue attacking you while you run to the top of the stairs, and the Dominators will cast Frenzy that increases damage and attack speed significantly. Don't get me wrong with this dungeon, the bosses do a pretty good amount of damage and will certainly be a challenge on Tyrannical Weeks. However, I think this dungeon is really about ad management more than the bosses themselves. Although I do enjoy this dungeon, I think that this one will probably fall into the difficult category when it comes to trying to heal this in Mythic Plus. Moving on to our other Legion dungeon, let's talk about Darkheart Thicket, which like Blackrook Hold is another very linear dungeon. This is another dungeon where the bosses aren't all that difficult. Archdruid Gladalis has a bleed that requires you to heal targets above 90%. Oakheart requires you to heal the tank when grabbed by the boss and prepare AoE heals for his Shattering Earth Stomp-like attack. Dressarion is only somewhat difficult in the fact there is constant movement for healers and the rest of the team. He only becomes difficult if people allow themselves to be blown into the eggs to hatch the whelplings. Shade of Xavius is really the most annoying of the bosses. He has a dot that reduces healing, he casts a Waking Nightmare spell that puts a circle around a target that silences and pacifies, so for this fight, melee should stack and range should stack so that no one is ever at risk of being silenced. However, if an ally gets attacked by Induced Paranoia, they have to run away or else risk fearing anyone near them. He then finally finishes with a nasty AoE attack that increases his overall damage. Outside of Xavius, mob control is important in this dungeon as well. The first set of mobs we run into are the Nightclaws that act similar to the Cats and Court of Stars, jumping to random enemies and leaving a nasty dot. The dot has to be healed up to 90% health in order to remove it. The Poisoners turn into spiders that also put a poison dot on random players that erupts after 6 seconds to deal AoE damage. Anytime you see Ruiners in the groups, you'll want to always kick Star Shower, that does a high damage AoE attack, and try to kick Despair when possible as it reduces overall healing for us. The Screechers aren't too bad. Outside of the Screech attack they have, which will disorient players for 4 seconds if not kicked. The Grizzlies are mobs that can become a complication if your group does not kill them quickly. They will cast a Maddening Roar which deals AoE damage and increases damage taken by the next roar by 50%. This continues to stack and will kill your group ultimately if you can't kill the ads quickly enough. Finally, they also summon ads that will chase players and leave puddles on the ground. As you come up to Oakheart, there are Dryads that can be annoying as they like to leap backwards similar to the Pelters again in Neltharion's Lair, and then attack with a Poison Spear ability that reduces healing and does damage that needs to be dispelled. These ads often can cause a dungeon to go badly if they leap in the wrong direction and pull additional packs. The Dwellers at the bottom of the ramp before Oakheart aren't too big of a deal outside of the fact that you need to kick their channel cast or it will fear the target. After killing Oakheart, the most to look out for are the Blood Elementals as they cast a Descending Blood Bomb that does high damage. They also have a charge attack that will knock players in their line backwards. Since this is the only way to Dressarion, this means getting knocked back into Dragon Eggs and hatching Whelplings. You'll want to make sure that you dodge this charge. Outside of these groups, the Satyrs, Imps, and Bats leading up to Xavius, the last boss, are not that difficult to heal through as long as your group manages their kicks and stuns. Keep an eye out for the Stalkers as they will jump to 2 targets, dealing a good amount of damage that will need to be healed quickly. Again, this is another dungeon that I quite enjoy healing, however I think this one will again fall into the difficult category for me, particularly because of all the mob management and opportunities to miss pull. Let's move into Everbloom. For me, I think this dungeon is going to be hard to tell at this point in time. One reason is because, unlike many of the other dungeons, this dungeon has never been set for Mythic Plus, so it will likely undergo several tunings and more than likely some hotfixes. The bosses in this dungeon aren't particularly difficult, outside of Archmage Soul, which I think will be the hardest of them all, especially for pug groups because of all the dodging and jumping over the Ring of Fire. I'll be curious to see if Blizzard makes it required to kill Zeratak, since you don't have to kill him in order to complete the dungeon in time walking. I'm guessing that they won't make it required, as it will add extra time to the dungeon. From a mob perspective, I think that this dungeon might be more on the fun side because of the potential to pull large groups for AoE damage. There may also be opportunities for variation in which mobs you want to pull, but again, this will be dependent on the percentages that Blizzard attributes to each of the mobs. If Blizzard does well with the tuning and percentages, I feel like this dungeon is destined to be in the not too bad category, and possibly even in the best category in terms of healing. However, if Blizzard does a typically bad tuning, it will easily fall into the very difficult bot. Moving on to Throne of Tides, I think that almost the entire WoW community will agree that Blizzard could have picked any other dungeon from Cataclysm and we would have been happier. This dungeon is another linear one that is quite boring across both the mobs and bosses. It also has elevators that will need to be addressed because they're not conducive to a Mythic Plus environment where speed is important. If you've done this dungeon on time walking, you'll recall the elevators that come down often take a while to get there, and then you all have to actually jump so that your character lands on top of the elevator, or else you'll miss it altogether. For me, once I've hit at least a minimum of plus 20 on this dungeon, I will more than likely always try to switch this key out for another. Looking at our last two mega dungeons split for the season 3 pool, I think it all comes down to how Blizzard tunes them. These dungeons have some hard-hitting mobs with a mixture of channeled spells, AoE, and dot effects that will be a challenge for a healer. Most of the bosses are also quite high movement fights, which can be difficult for certain healers as well. For me, there are only two bosses in these dungeons that will make or break whether or not they're in the not too bad category or they fall down in with our Throne of Tides dungeon. The two bosses are Manifested Timeways and Morchi. Both of these bosses are extremely high movement fights that can be super punishing to groups. Even on regular mythic difficulty now, these bosses are group killers due to the number of moving mechanics and high damage events. As long as Blizzard can find a way to tune these two bosses without completely overtuning any of the others, I'm hopeful that these will fall into the not too bad to difficult tier for our list. For now, we're going to put both of these in the difficult tier because I don't think Blizzard will get tuning right on the first pass without some hot fixes. So there we have it. Here are my initial predictions for the difficulty that each of these Mythic Plus dungeons presents for us as healers. Overall, I'm happy about this upcoming season set of dungeons, and I'm looking forward to trying them out at patch 10.2 launch. Let me know what you think, if I'm missing anything in my predictions, if I'm totally off base, and what dungeons you're looking forward to most with the upcoming patch.